Because you want to manage not being exhausted on the short term, like getting into that attitude that you don't like. That does create some exhaustion in the short term. But you also don't want to be too one-sided, which creates exhaustion in the long term. So you want to balance where you're getting your needs met in the present, but you're also getting your needs met in the future. And I think that's the trade-off that people make when they're one or the other. Hello, welcome to my channel. So today I want to do a deep dive on one of the basic topics of introversion versus extroversion, because even though this is one of the basic topics that I feel like a lot of people have a surface level knowledge about, because there's so much widespread surface level information about it, it means there've been a lot of misconceptions. Like, is it about where you get your energy? Is it about the number of people? What is it exactly about? So this is kind of the agenda. So what we're going to do. So I want to go over what are some common misconceptions. So I'll go over what I feel like a lot of people will say about these things, and then we'll go into actually what do Binet and Jung say about these things. Then I'll do a side-by-side comparison of extroversion versus introversion, and then getting into briefly the 4 types of introversion and extroversion. So as to the common misconceptions with a question mark, some of these might be true, some of these might be false, but these are some common things that I hear. So if you Google what is an introvert, you get a shy, reticent person. What I hear a lot from people is that it's where you get your energy. Supposedly it's where you get energy from alone time. I hear quiet. You've got friends, but a small group of them, quality versus quantity. And you like to chill at home reading or watching Netflix. So I'm not saying that these are true or these are false, just that this is what the public says about them. An extrovert, I hear, if you Google what an extrovert is, it's an outgoing, overtly expressive person, according to Google. Gets energy from socializing, likes to talk a lot, likes parties and social events. So these are things that I hear a lot about just from in the general public. These terms have really made their way into the general public, which I think is good. I think that overall that's been a net positive. But some of these things are somewhat true and some of these things are somewhat false. So I want to get into actually those things. So Carl Jung got his terms, introvert and extrovert, originally somewhat from Binet. So in 1903, Binet coined these terms introspection and externospection, which I still hear the word introspection a lot. I don't really ever hear externospection. But if you break down the root words of this, intro is inwardly, within, on the inside. Spect is to watch over, and then shun is the state or condition of. So introspection is the state of watching over what's going on within or what's going on inside. You're kind of watching what's going on inwardly. Externospection, same parts of speech except for that extra, which means outward, outside, and beyond. So it's the state of watching over what's going on outwardly or outside. So there's nothing necessarily just from these words about people or not people. It's just inside or outside. Now outside includes people, but it's not just like numbers of people so far. So then we get into Carl Jung, where he actually coined these terms introversion and extroversion. So sometimes I'll use extra, the prefix A, and sometimes I'll use extroversion with an O. They can pretty much be used interchangeably. If you look up the difference in the prefixes, extra or extro, they're pretty much interchangeable for each other. Slight differences, one's just like another form. I think one's a slightly different Latin form. Carl Jung used the A spelling. In present day, it's most common in America to use the O spelling, so it's just the spelling is all over the place. If that's something that bothers you, there's not going to be consistency on this. I know people have their different reasons for which one they prefer. So in 1921, he coined introversion, extroversion. So intro, same thing, inwardly, within, on the inside. But vert is to turn, and then jeune is the state of. So the state of turning inward. So similar, so you turn inward, and if we go back to that introspection, you turn inward and you watch what's going on inside. Extroversion is the state of turning outward and watching what's going on outside if we take that externospection. So I want to talk just briefly about ambiversion, because this is something that has come up a lot. I don't hear it as much anymore, but maybe like 5 years or so I was really hearing this term ambivert. And there is a quote from Carl Jung kind of about this. So in the extroverted section, he said, "A normal extroverted attitude does not, of course, mean that the individual behaves invariably in accordance with the extroverted schema. Even in the same individual, many psychological happenings may be observed in which the mechanism of introversion is concerned. A habitus can be called extroverted only when the mechanism of extroversion predominates." So what this is basically saying is within an extrovert, meaning someone whose habits are of extroversion predominantly, you're still going to see introverted happenings because there's a lot of different schema going on within the individual. So within one person, you're going to see extroversion and introversion, because it's just, how can you never look outward? How can you never look inward? You're getting toward like type of very unhealthy psychological neurosis type thing if you're really 100% of the time only looking inward or 100% of the time only looking outward. So the root words of ambiversion is, the only difference is that ambi, which means both. So it's the state of turning in both directions. That sometimes you're turning outward and sometimes you're turning inward. And I would say, like Carl Jung's talking about, pretty much everyone is an ambivert. But for the sake of what we're talking about, it's which one predominates. The odds of you being 50-50, it's it's pretty much not going to happen. I was a math major, and they talked about that for something to be exactly 50% is impossible. It's going to be 50.0000001 maybe percent. So you're never going to get an exact 50-50. One of them is going to predominate, if only slightly. So words that are going to come up are the subject and the object. So for my purposes, when he uses the word subject, he's talking about the internal self. And when he talks about the object, he's talking about the external world. So my support for this is, if you just Google the definition of subject, it's a person or thing that is being discussed, described, or dealt with. And you combine that with these quotes from Jung: the subject is man, we are the subject. And later on, he has a quote where he talks about introversion and extroversion are both valuable because you need to be able to look at the self and you need to be able to look at the world. And I'm going to continue that later on. So when he's talking about introversion and extroversion are both valuable because you need to look at the self and the world, that's part of what the subject is, because he talks about when you're introverted, you're habitually looking at the subject. When you're extroverted, you're habitually looking at the object. So when he talks about subject, that's pretty much the self. And when he talks about the object, that's the external world. If you look up like the definition of object, specifically like grammatically, subject and object of a sentence, a person or thing to which a specified action or feeling is directed. It's what it's directed toward. There was one sentence where he uses these words. He's like objective or external. So he's kind of, I think I'll have the sentence later on in the quotes, but basically that showed in that quote that he was using those two things interchangeably. It's objective or it's external. And then again, in that same quote where he was talking about the self and the world are both valuable. When he talks about the subject, we're talking about the internal self. And when he talks about the object, we're talking about the external world. And when you habitually look at the internal self, predominantly, that's an introvert. And when you predominantly look at the external world, habitually more often, that's extroverted. So I want to start getting into these quotes. So the former, he was talking about extroversion and introversion. I would term general attitude types, since they are distinguished by the direction of general interest or libido movement. The general attitude types, as I have pointed out more than once, are differentiated by their particular attitude to the object. So, and I have some brackets here. So an attitude is a settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something, typically one that is reflected in a person's behavior. So you've got a certain way of thinking about the object, about the external world. And because you think a certain way about the external world, that's going to be reflected in your behavior. And this word libido, I know a lot of times we talk about this like in a sexual context, but it's just the energy of the drive as a component of the life instinct. So it's, where's this energy flowing? When we're talking about the external world, in which direction is the energy flowing? And what is your attitude in relation to the external world? The introvert's attitude to the object, the external world, is an abstracting one. At bottom, he is always facing the problem of how libido can be withdrawn from the object, as though an attempted ascendancy on the part of the object had to be continually frustrated. So the introvert is always facing this problem. How can I get energy from the external world? And just continue, like never being able to solve that problem of how you can get energy from the external world. And it's continually frustrated, trying to get ascendancy over, trying to get some hold over this thing. Like, no, I can figure out the external world and I can enjoy being in the external world and get energy from it. Trying to get ascendancy on it, but it's continually frustrated in that regard. So that's the introvert's attitude toward it. The extrovert, on the contrary, maintains a positive relation to the object. So he never said directly the words, the introvert maintains a negative relation to the object, but when you're talking about how it frustrates you and you're trying to get energy from it, trying to get ascendancy over, and then he contrasts it from the extrovert, on the contrary, maintains a positive relation, I think we could say that the introvert remains kind of like a negative relation to the external world. To such an extent does he affirm its importance that his subjective attitude is continually being orientated by and related to the object. And fond, I don't know if that's a typo or what that is. And fond, the object can never have sufficient value. For him, therefore, its importance must always be paramount. He has more of a so the extrovert has more of a positive relationship with the external world, and it will continually affirm its importance. The attitude of the subjective attitudes, the attitude of the self, is continually being orientated by the external world. And you can never get enough of it. It never has sufficient value. He's always trying to get more and more of the external world, and its importance is paramount. It's very important. At this point, a mere general indication must suffice. On the one hand, I need only point to the peculiarity of the extrovert, which constantly urges him to spend and propagate himself in every way, and on the other, to the tendency of the introvert to defend himself against external claims, to conserve himself from any expenditure of energy directly related to the object, thus consolidating for himself the most secure and impregnable position. What the one brings about by multiplicity of relations, the other gains by monopoly. So there's so much going on here, and he was just talking about the difference in the way different species have biologically adapted. So for example, you might have, he didn't say insects, but he talked about how there might be one species who has tons of offspring. So like I'm thinking of like insects. They have thousands of offspring. That's the way that they gain. They kind of bring multiplicity of relations. But then you have other animals that they just have, one offspring, and they try to be very impenetrable with a defense. Like I'm thinking like an elephant. They just have one baby, or like a cow or something. And so they're just like these really big defense creatures, and they put their effort into the defense as opposed to kind of like this multiplicity. So extroverts want to spend and propagate themselves in every way, spending themselves in the external world. The introvert is trying to defend themselves, so it's definitely a difference, kind of like an offensive versus defensive relation to the world. The introvert trying to conserve the expenditure of energy in relation to the external world. A reversal of type often proves exceedingly harmful to the physiological well-being of the organism, often provoking an acute state of exhaustion. So one thing that Carl Jung talks about, which we'll see later, is one-sidedness, that you don't want to be too one-sided in the realm of extroversion versus introversion. So you don't want to be too lopsided, like you don't want to be 90% extroverted and 10% introverted. However, you don't want to attempt to reverse it. Like if you're an extrovert, it's going to have a lot of exhaustion. So if you're naturally an extrovert, you don't want to try to become 60% introverted or something like that, because that's harmful. That's going to lead to a state of exhaustion. Interest and attention follow objective happenings, and primarily those of the immediate environment. Not only persons, but things seize and rivet his interest. So I like to talk about like not only persons, like extroversion is not exclusive to people or being sociable. Not only persons, but things seize and rivet his interest. His actions, therefore, are also governed by the influence of persons and things. They are directly related to objective data and determinations, and are, as it were, exhaustively explainable on these grounds. Extroverted action is recognizably related to objective conditions. Insofar as it is not purely reactive to environmental stimuli, its character is constantly applicable to the actual circumstances, and it finds adequate and appropriate play within the limits of the objective situation. So I like this word applicable. It's constantly applicable. It's constantly seeing like how can we apply things or have an application of something to these actual circumstances. That's a big difference between introversion and extroversion. Extroversion is kind of in touch, and it knows what's the appropriate play within the limits of the external situation. It's very in touch with what's going to work and what is going to be received and have a good application externally. Sometimes the introverted functions have a good understanding of what they feel like might be best or what might be ideal, but it's really out of touch sometimes with what's actually going to work and what are the limits. When you're working with ideals, because when you're inside, it's just all ideal. It's all ideals. There's no bounds or constricting factors. But with the extrovert, they understand that we have these constricting factors, and so we need to know what's going to work within these factors, not just ideal. So you have to make some concessions and some compromises when you're working externally. So this next quote is getting to be about this one-sidedness. If you're too extroverted, this is what can tend to happen. Now, what I tend to notice that I want people to be careful of, if you're an introvert, you might read this quote and be like, oh yes, extroverts need to learn this. Extroverts need to know that being too extroverted is bad. But I want people to check themselves and understand that I know that it's comfortable to be whatever attitude you like. If you're an introvert, it's really comfortable to be introverted. If you're an extrovert, it's really comfortable to be extroverted. But you can't point the finger at extroverts and say, yeah, you need to balance yourself with some introversion, without also pointing the finger at yourself and saying, yeah, I need to balance myself. So if you're too one-sided as an extrovert, the body accordingly suffers, to say nothing of the soul. A too extroverted attitude may actually become so regardless of the subject, the self, that the latter is entirely sacrificed to so-called objective claims, to the demands, for instance, of a continually extending business because orders lie claiming one's attention, or because profitable possibilities are constantly being opened up, which must instantly be seized. So they have such a good knack for these opportunities in the external world, but when you spend so much time with these opportunities in the external world, that your body internally, like if you're not paying attention internally to your bodily sensations, if you're not paying attention to your soul, that it will begin to suffer and you start to kind of lose yourself. It becomes so regardless of the subject. So basically losing the self because you've, lost yourself in external claims. This is the extrovert's danger. He becomes caught up in objects and the external, wholly losing himself in their toils. In the foregoing section, I emphasize the tendency to a certain one-sidedness in the extroverted attitude, due to the controlling power of the objective factor in the course of psychic events. The extroverted type is constantly tempted to give himself away, apparently, in favor of the object, and to assimilate his subject to the object. So yeah, tendency to lose himself in the world's toils, give himself away, assimilate himself to the world. So really the issue with extroverts can be losing themselves in the world. If you don't kind of seek to somewhat balance out that extroverted and introverted attitude, too much of this one-sidedness. Self and world are commensurable factors. Hence, a normal introverted attitude is just as valid and has as good a right to existence as a normal extroverted attitude. So he's talking about, like, the self is important, which is representing introversion in the subject in this case, and the world is really important, and that's talking about, like, the object or the external. And so they're saying it's normal. There's going to be introverts, there's going to be extroverts, and they're both normal, and they're both good, and they're both important. So this quote is now talking about what is the issue with introverts, if introverts are going to be one-sided. So once again, I want to mention, like, if the extroverts are watching this part, and I say, oh yeah, introverts need to know this. So just make sure that instead of pointing the finger to the other attitude, which you don't belong to, make sure you additionally point it towards yourself. The more the ego seeks to secure every possible liberty, independence, superiority, and freedom from obligations, the deeper does it fall into the slavery of objective facts. The subject's freedom of mind is chained to an ignominious financial dependence, his unconcertedness of action suffers now and again, a distressing collapse in the face of public opinion, his moral superiority gets swamped in inferior relationships, and his desire to dominate ends in a pitiful craving to be loved. For a peculiar cowardliness develops from this fear of the object. He shrinks from making either himself or his opinion effective, always dreading an intensified influence on the part of the object. The introvert tends to seek freedom from the external world. So, like, an example could be, maybe you don't like dentist appointments, and you don't like that you have to go talk to people, and, you don't like these external things or whatever. But, if you put off going to the dentist for a long time, let's say, for an example, eventually your teeth are not going to be doing very well. And that's going to create a slavery that was worse. Like, you seek freedom from the external world, but the external world's going to come barking at you, and it's going to create a slavery. So it talks about finances can suffer, unconcertedness of action. Like, I think if you don't ever want to be out in the external world, like if you never want to work out, for example, that's something that introverts can have a problem with, is if you have little inclination to activity, suffering with weight, and eventually your body's going to come barking at you, and then that might create health problems, and then you're really going to have to deal with the external world. Like, on the short term, you can put it off, but on the long term, you cannot put it off. And it talks about inferior relationships. I think when a lot of people double down on their specific attitude, so if you are an extrovert who really doubles down on extroversion, or if you're an introvert who really doubles down on introversion, this is where I see a lot of people who are single who don't want to be single. It's one thing if you choose that, and that's just a lifestyle you want. But if you want to be with someone and you can't seem to find anyone, a lot of times it's because it's over predominance of the one attitude. The extrovert is kind of hollowed out the self, and so people can kind of sense that hollowness. And for the introversion, it's like they're never getting out there, and it seems like their life isn't in order. And so to me, a lot of times being involuntarily single is as a result of an extremity of the one attitude, typically. It talks about, for introverts, it's like a cowardliness. Your opinion is not effective, and a lot of times introverts will feel like they're misunderstood, or people don't listen to them, or it's so hard being an introvert. But everyone has access to an extroverted attitude. They both do things for you. The extroversion helps you take action, apply things in the external world, and be valuable to other people, and help you have valuable relationships. You have to turn outward at some point. Introversion helps you process things and think about the ideal of things, and know the self, being in touch with yourself and how you think and feel about things. And so they're both incredibly important. And so I think when you're getting in the realm of like 75% one or the other and more, that's really becoming a problem. In my opinion, I wouldn't shoot for 50-50, but I wouldn't be shooting for 75% either. I'd be shooting for maybe like 60%, let's say. Because you want to manage not being exhausted on the short term, like getting into that attitude that you don't like. That does create some exhaustion in the short term. But you also don't want to be too one-sided, which creates exhaustion in the long term. So you want to balance where you're getting your needs met in the present, but you're also getting your needs met in the future. And I think that's the trade-off that people make when they're one or the other. So now I just want to do a side-by-side comparison. So extroversion is the external application of thoughts, feelings, intuitions, and senses. So I'm getting into kind of the 4 types of extroversion, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Introversion is the internal processing of thoughts, feelings, intuitions, and senses. So same thing. So extroversion, seeing the bounds externally, it talked about, and how can we apply things externally. Application was a direct word used. And introversion is going inward, and it's placing something within. So it's not just, here's a thought, boom. But it's in the introverted thinking, for example, is hearing a thought, but it's got this filter. Does this make sense to me? Does this feel right to me? And it orients toward the self. and then it will assimilate something after it's gone through that self filter. Extroversion is a state of turning outward due to interest. It talks about this is what interests you, so that's what you'll tend to do habitually. Introversion is a state of turning inward due to interest, and it talked about, if we take those words, externospection or introspection, it's kind of also a watching over what happens inside versus a watching over what happens outside. Extroversion affirms the importance of the external. Introversion affirms the importance of the internal. So one thing that's going to happen over and over and over again with these side-by-sides, you're going to see the words external and internal. So that's the biggest difference between extroversion and introversion. I've heard some people actually say that they've switched in their mind, that they don't call it extroversion and introversion anymore because there's just become so much associated with introversion and extroversion about parties and sociability, that there's just so much misunderstanding that it almost is better to think of it to yourself as just turning outward or turning inward. For extroversion, positive energy flows from the external. From introversion, there's a problem of energy flow from the external. Introverts are trying to get ascendancy over that thing, whereas extroversion, there's this good symbiotic relationship with them in the external. Extroversion seeks to spend and propagate himself in every way. Introversion seeks to conserve energy expenditure. And to continue that, it talks about extroversion gains by multiplicity and introversion gains by monopoly. So introversion gains by a deepening in one area and putting up a defense, whereas extroversion spends and propagates and multiplies in many ways. Extroversion, there was a quote, they have access to and are on good terms with the world. Introversion has access to and on good terms with the self. And everyone has access to both. Everyone has access to the extroverted attitude and the introverted attitude. It's just a matter of which one do you do habitually more. Then we get to one-sidedness. So the issue with extroversion is their one-sidedness. They can lose himself, body, and soul in toils of the external. Introversion, cowardliness creates a slavery of finances, action, and relationships. And there were more categories there. So it's just a matter of you want to be able to balance what you like and what's comfortable and what's not going to be exhausting on the short term with also what ultimately you will like on the long term. And, you want to do yourself a favor that you don't want to have short-term enjoyment now that you're going to have to pay the price for later. Like, ultimately, you want to try to balance where you're going to enjoy it. It's going to be a little hard work now, but you're still going to enjoy it so that in the future you will enjoy it. You're not having to, pay back, and you don't want to be, creating a debt to yourself that you have to pay back at a later time. So then I want to get into there's 4 types. So I think if a lot of people, people just talk about these umbrella terms, introversion and extroversion, but there are 4 types. So turning inward toward what? There's a lot that could be going on inside, and turning outward toward what? There's a lot going on outside besides just people, for example. So for introversion, you could turn inward toward thinking. So I talked about for the TPs, it's like an internal parsing of thoughts. That's the filter. So it's not just they hear a thought and then they assimilate it, but they have this filter. Does this make sense to me? Do I think this is right? Is that precise enough? Does it have enough nuance? Introverted feeling, similar thing. It's an internal parsing, like introverted thinking, but it's of values and resonance. So, we've got these standards of behavior. Do these standards of behavior that everyone does that make sense to me? Okay, women shave their legs. Does that make sense to me? Do I like that standard of behavior? Does that resonate with me? Okay, men can't wear dresses. Does that standard of behavior make sense to me? Does that make sense? So it's not just accepting from the external, but it's this filtering and this parsing through. Introverted sensing, it's an internal parsing of sensory experiences. So these sensory experiences could be, you have an experience and it stirs you and it leaves an impression on you. These are quotes. And then you go inward and you say, wow, what's the meaning of that experience? And you're making the meaning of all these past experiences and how the past has informed who you are today, your ancestors and your lineage. But it's also the internal parsing of sensory experiences in the sense of oh, this blanket is really fuzzy and this is really comfortable and really in tune with what's comfortable to your body. And it's really good if I go to bed at this time because that feels really good. So it's in tune sensory organs in that way. Introverted intuition, it's an internal parsing of the unseen. So the word with introverted intuition is kind of a vision. So it's kind of turning off what's happening externally. And you have this kind of vision in your head. So it's not seen to anyone else, but to you it's seen, and you go inside and you're parsing, okay, here's the clear, talked about the clear outline of the vision for the future. What do I need to transform about this? So in going inside, parsing of the unseen. Then we get into extroversion, and there were quotes with extroversion about application. So extroverted thinking is the external application of thought systems. So it's not this internal parsing of it, but okay, what are the bounds of these thought things? What are our constraints? Okay, it's not ideal, but what are the constraints that we're working with here, and how can we apply that? So, we have this goal, and how can we reach our goal on schedule with Q2 timelines, and who do we need to coordinate, and who do we need to delegate to, and maybe we have this project management system, and how can we apply this thought that we have and make sure it becomes a reality, becomes realized externally. Extroverted feeling an external application of standards of behavior. So they've got these standards of behavior for people, and this is what would make harmony for the group. So these are the social graces. These are things that really land well for people. This is how we will apply it, and kind of in the kindest way possible, kind of a regulation of these standards of behavior in a very smooth way with a lot of social grace, moving these different pieces so we're all having this kumbaya, harmonious, all have this rousing corresponding emotions. Extroverted sensing, you could say an external application of, I liked the word amplification in this case, but an external amplification of sensory experiences. So seeing so much externally, so it's not necessarily so much, within the body is this comfortable, but just externally, how can we amplify and apply these sensory experiences? Maybe we could, wheelie on a bike, or there's a loud firework, or, how can we really amplify these sensory experiences? And being really in tune to the external sensory experiences, very present and very in tune with that. Extroverted intuition, we could use the word application again, but I like the word realization in this case. The external realization of the unseen possibilities. So it's not just like with introverted intuition, it's going in, finding this kind of like one vision. Extroverted intuition, there's all these unseen possibilities, and how can we realize these in the external world? What if we sang a song or started this podcast and, an external realization of the possibilities? So these are so, a lot of these are so different from each other, and I think when you go back to some of these misconceptions about introversion versus extroversion, introverts read books and watch Netflix, and extroverts go to parties, I think a lot of these are really an oversimplification, and in some of those cases just wrong view. I think it stops a lot of people from typing correctly because of these false definitions of what these terms are. So when you think about liking to be in a big group of people, all the introverted functions are turning inward. So yeah, probably the groups of people is probably not going to be that interesting. But also neither is watching Netflix, because when you watch Netflix, you're turning outward. If you read a book, you're turning outward. So reading is kind of a conglomerate. Like if you turn outward to the book and then you turn inward and process, and there's this movie going on in your mind maybe, then it's kind of a back and forth. It depends on how you read, I suppose. But just watching Netflix, I don't know that that's you're not going inward necessarily. You could just be kind of blindly watching this thing and it's just going on, So watching Netflix, I wouldn't say is necessarily by definition an introverted activity. But even a lot of these extroverted ones are not particularly people-oriented. Extroverted thinking is talking about regulating. There's a lot about regulating people, but it's not people-oriented or liking to be around people necessarily. But it's just regulating for the sake of a goal. And it's almost kind of like using people. It's kind of a rude word to use for it, but it's not necessarily using people in a rude way, but just how can we mobilize people toward this goal? So that is an extroverted function, but it's not about going to parties. But another thing is, I think that whenever I've given the advice that you don't want to be too one-sided, introverts shouldn't be so introverted and extroverts shouldn't be so extroverted. A lot of times people take that advice to mean, oh, Alexis is saying that I need to be around people. But when I say that you shouldn't be too one-sided in introversion and extroversion, if you're an introvert, for example, I'm not saying you need to get around more people necessarily. Now, it depends on what it depends on which of your types of extroversion you have. So, for example, ISTPs, they have extroverted sensing second. So my advice for ISTPs is not to go to more dinner parties and go drink more wine with a bunch of people. My advice for ISTPs, for example, is to go be in more sensory environments. So that could be with people, for example, but it's mostly to get in your body more. Maybe start going on bike rides. Maybe start doing a project where you're working with your hands, So just because it's just basically talking about get in the external world more. That could include people depending on what type of extroversion it is. And I think extroverted sensing does include people sometimes, but it's not exclusive to people. I think it's a muscle that you have to build, but there's a lot of long-term satisfaction on the other end of it. If you're interested in the concepts of introversion and extroversion, I just did a video on loops, which is very interesting, and it has the concept with introversion and extroversion built in. And I also did a video of each of the types at their best versus at their worst, which definitely plays with this introversion-extroversion dichotomy as well. So yeah, as well as I have all the playlists for each of the personality types linked in the description. So if you're an INFJ and you want to know all the videos I've done about INFJs, those will be in the description as well. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.